How does a ruling class maintain its social dominance so that it can set up and ossify the government and the mode of production that will perpetuate and strengthen itself? Well, Marx says what it does is create a class consciousness that permeates throughout the rest of society and therefore co-opts the other oppressed classes by gaining their trust in their legitimacy. Well, how does that happen? Well, by making the values of the dominant class the values of the rest of society. So, for example, a serf was content to remain a serf because they believed that the noble was always acting in their interest to protect them, and that therefore that they had a duty to produce food and supply the noble with honor and dignity that they deserved because of their special function within the total world of this person. And so the serfs were willing to be serfs because the ruling class created an ideology that fit them into place and provided the means for their subsistence and growth and their own development. What Marx says this is the special feature of capitalism, is that the class consciousness of the bourgeois capitalist does not create a sense of trust in the worker. In fact, they do not create an ideology that then allows the worker to feel that they fit into a system that ultimately is based on their good. In fact, what the bourgeois capitalist does is create a system, a class system, that makes the wage laborer poorer and poorer. They become paupers. And thus, capitalism creates an antagonism that cannot be resolved except by revolution. So what we want to do in this video is explain how the engine of economic growth that the capitalist sets up, in fact, is the engine of revolution. And it all comes about by the bourgeois capitalist being the presider over two separate forces of progress, you might say, or oppression, however you look at it. Well, the bourgeois capitalist, of course, has control over the means of production. They own all the land, they own all the resources, they own all the factories and the machines. And therefore what they do is set up this hard and fast division between themselves and anybody who's going to work those means of production. The laborer has no ownership whatsoever, and so they are totally reliant on payment in money from their master, the bourgeois capitalist. So this division between the forces of industrial growth and wage labor actually is something which the capitalist unwittingly supports, but is the engine of their destruction. How does that occur? Well, of course, once I have myself as a wage laborer, say for example I work in a car factory, well, I want to get a job. But I'm not the only one who wants to get a job. The idea is there are many more workers than there are jobs out there. And so by creating this wage labor force, I create, as the capitalist, a competition between laborers. The laborer themselves becomes just another commodity that is being bought now by the bourgeois capitalist. And that's in the interest of the capitalist. By creating competition, they create a lowering of wages and therefore an increase in their profits, because as we saw before, profit only comes through variable capital, through the wage laborer being willing to get paid less than the total value of their labor. Why are they willing? Because of this setting up of competition between laborers. But of course, what's interesting is at the same time, the capitalist is interested in improving technology because they need more goods. They need better production to meet the supply of new markets and the exploitation of old ones. So therefore, the means of production grow. And as they grow, the markets grow. And as the markets grow, boundaries are destroyed. And the conditions of labor in every country become the same. So what happens is a homogenization of the proletariat. The workers in Germany's conditions versus the workers in England's conditions, or the workers in America's conditions, they all become pretty much the same. The social conditions get set up so that now women work and children work, and the reason why they can work is because you no longer need strength to do anything. Everything is automated, and therefore it doesn't matter your sex or your gender or your age or anything like that. That all gets homogenized, gets equalized, so that now there is no national industry, there's only international corporations, as we saw. Well, as a result of this elimination of all boundaries, the only thing that the proletariat has that can define them is their wage labor and the exploitation under their wage labor. They all become exploited, and therefore they all develop a common experience, a common set of interests, and that set of interests unites them into a new class, which we would call the proletariat. A class consciousness gets set up that's opposed to the capitalist class consciousness. And so what we see is the competition between laborers gets overrun by this common enemy, this alliance against exploitation, an alliance of interests that sets up this proletarian class consciousness. And that therefore sets up a common front, a common enemy, a common set of values that are distinct from the capitalist values. And thus we see that the very capitalist system that makes the capitalist money, that profit motive, and move toward exploitation, actually sets up the force that is a majority force against the capitalist. And the reason why this is a majority force is because what we see here, as we said, is the conversion of all skilled labor into unskilled labor through the automation of technology, therefore increases the scope of the proletariat class, so that everybody who is not extremely rich and therefore doesn't control the means of production gets subsumed into a working class of wage laborers, so that no one is exempt except the very few who own the means of production from this proletarian class consciousness. And thus the proletariat, unlike any other class, oppressed class in the history of the world and its economic development, becomes the majority, not the minority that's oppressed, and becomes such that there's no way when it revolts that it will create a new minority of oppressors versus oppressed. It itself is classless. It itself owns nothing, and therefore it cannot develop a power or a set of resources that then come to dominate another class. It itself becomes the totally rejected ones, the total untouchables, so that they have nothing to lose but their chains. And so what happens is then we have the seeds for the revolution of the majority. The majority now no longer want to be dominated by this set of few capitalists. And so a revolution must inevitably take place, which sets up this intermediate state, which Marx calls the rule of the proletariat, or the dictatorship of the proletariat. What will happen there is precisely because of the interest in class consciousness of the proletariat, all private ownership of public resources goes away. Now notice here, I do not say, and neither does Marx, that no one owns anything, that everything is unowned. He doesn't say that. What he says is we eliminate the kind of property that concentrates the resources in the hands of a few and exploits others. In other words, what becomes publicly owned or owned by the state which is dominated by the proletariat are the public means of production, the industrial resources, the economic structure, and the base structure for production and trade and all of that. Private things like houses and plots of land, Marx even says there, it might be the case that there's still private ownership. What will not be the case is bourgeois kind of ownership, and we'll talk about that when we concentrate on the communist notion of property or communal ownership in our next set of lectures. But the key here is, once the proletariat takes over, there does not become another ruling class and therefore another oppressed class. The capitalists themselves have been stripped of all their capital, and so therefore they themselves, by their very revolution, become a part of the proletariat. They themselves become a part that must contribute to the total good, and they themselves not have domination over any of the resources. And thus the resources are under public ownership. Therefore, there can be no separate class that oppresses another class. The majority is taken over, and the majority has become the many. So, once this occurs completely, then we have a society of equals. Thus, we eliminate an exchange economy, and in its place becomes an economy that's totally based on production for use value instead of exchange value, and therefore for contribution rather than consumption. And thus we have, as the end result, a classless society. This is how Marx puts it. The essential condition for the existence and for the sway of the bourgeois class is the formation and augmentation of capital. In other words, the accumulation of the means of profit. The condition for capital is wage labor, because of course we capitalize on the underpayment of the worker for the increase of surplus value, as we saw. Wage labor rests exclusively on competition between laborers, and thus by producing this wage labor we produce the underpayment situation that occurs through competition, through supply exceeding demand. The advance of industry, whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeois, replaces the isolation of laborers. But this parallel process of advanced industry destroys all boundaries between laborers. And so it replaces the isolation of laborers by their revolutionary association or combination due to association. Association why? With their common interest. Nothing separates them anymore. Industry has destroyed all sacred boundaries, and the only thing that's left is the pure fact that you're making money and are a worker. And thus, the development of modern industry therefore cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeois produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeois therefore produces above all is its own grave diggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. And now we see why.